Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Budget and Finance Committee meeting for Monday, June 11th, 2018. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And I'd ask for no distractions or noises from the audience, please, as we proceed with our meeting. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee, joined by Mr. Kretz and Mr. Blumenfield, and we're ready to begin. So we'll take our we'll take our public comment on multiple items first. So I'll ask Mr. Spindler to come up first, followed by Mr. Herman, and then is there anybody else here who would like to speak on more than one agenda item? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Spindler.
So we got item number 8. It's in CD2. So you have to recuse yourself, Mr. Chair, because it's in your district. You have a conflict of interest. Please recuse yourself from item number 8. Note that, Mr. City Attorney.
Let me make a note.
Item number 13, you're borrowing from the reserve fund because you're getting sued too much. You're not settling these cases fast enough and reasonably enough. Shame, shame. And you got a suspended attorney that's the chair not doing his fucking job. And then number 11 is the best one. We're going to hire not one, but 2 outside counsels for one fucking case. 700 fucking attorneys at the city attorney's office, and you don't have anybody that can defend the city in Miles versus City of Los Angeles, really? That's because you have attorneys that know 2 things. One, how to charge $864 for costs when 390 of it would ever existed, and 2, parking tickets. Other than that, congratulations, Albright, E. and Schmidt, LLP, $800 an hour. Howell and Tharp, LLP, $650 an hour, and I want these attorney firms to get a down payment on their retainers. I believe $150,000 retainers should be reasonable. I love it, and I love looking at this dumb fucking Paul Krikorian giving away all this money with his suspended bar card. Now, he would join you, but his license has been suspended for almost 2 years now, so he can't participate, but he will give his legal advice to approve number 11. He will give his legal advice to approve number 13, and the city attorney will not file with the State Bar the required disclosure of that.
Mr. Herman? Mr. Herman is not here. Public comment on all items other than number 8 is now closed. Is Mr. Stanhope here? Sir, Mr. Stanhope? Okay, then comment on item number 8 is closed as well. So members, I would like to propose for consent approval items number 13, 16, 12, 13, 16, and 17. But on item 16, I would propose that we strike recommendation number 6 from the controller report and otherwise approve the item. Is there any objection to acting accordingly?
12, 13, 16. What do you say?
12, 13, 16 with the one amendment I noted, and 17.
What's the amendment? Striking.
To strike recommendation number 6 from the controller report.
Councilmember, item number 6 in the controller's report refers to funding for an audit that is actually not going to occur during 2018-19, so the request to transfer those funds is not necessary. That's why it needs to be struck.
Okay. All right. So without objection, then, that will be the action of the committee on those items. That'll bring us then to item number, I'm sorry, did I? Yes, that's right. So that'll bring us to item number 14. Item number 14, do we have a report from the controller's office? Okay, we'll hold that one on the desk. Item number 15. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So far, this is just a motion asking for an amendment to the code, but I'd like to know more specifically what purpose the funds would be put to. What are the sorts of things that these bid funds would be applicable to if this motion were to be approved that are not currently?
Right. If I could just explain really briefly what
Please.
what is currently approved.
Sure.
It is the way the bid trust fund ordinance is currently written. The only things that are approved are paying for a consultant to assist with the possible formation of a particular bid, of a new proposed bid. The second reason, the second purpose of the fund is to pay for city parcels that are being assessed. And my understanding in working with the clerk's office is that the bid and bids generally in the city have really exploded, expanded in a positive way, but they are not able to keep up with all of that without getting additional funding, preferably through this bid trust fund, to be able to do things like upgrade their program system upgrades, to make it easier for bids to submit documentation, for the clerk's office to ensure that the bids are keeping up with what they're supposed to be doing, for information, for things like that, which right now they don't have, for other things such as outreach, training, possibly best practices implementation, public information campaigning, things like that, that will assist in continuing to have the bid program flourish.
So really purely administrative support of the bids rather than programmatic funding for the bid's work in its area?
Correct. When you
Okay.
say you're talking about a particular bid's work in an area?
Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Any other questions on this, members? Mr. Kretz.
So will this subtract from other funding for bids? So would it in any way make it more difficult for bids to fund their ongoing expenses?
No, it would be separate. My understanding of how the money is kept within the trust fund right now is that the general fund money goes to fund portions of this bid trust fund, and then the money that is recovered through the bid assessments that are intended to pay for certain things, that will not affect the bids themselves. So they will continue to form, they will continue to assess, they will continue to pay the city for their admin costs the way they have been since the beginning of bids.
And the activities that we're hoping to pay for through this change, how were those activities funded previous to the change?
Rick Scott, City Clerk's Office. We had a motion that was adopted by council back in 2016, and it directed us to do a public outreach campaign and some other things. And the motion directed us to use the 659 fund. Well, we set doing those things in the motion, and when we found out, though, we couldn't use the 659 fund because it wasn't designated for that. So it's actually those things that we're trying to accomplish, in addition to anything else we can think of, because this was adopted back in 2000 when the program was really kind of getting started. We only had 11, 15 bids at the time. And it's really expanded since that time. Our staff hasn't increased. In fact, it's even less than we used to have. And we just need the money to do the things that council has asked us to do along the way. But we're not taking any money from any other source. It's already in the 659 fund. We just need the authorization to use the fund for the things we've been directed to use it for.
I mean,
Mr. Bloomfield.
the only thing it competes with, although I support this, it makes sense, it competes with, funding new bids or renewing bids and those kind of costs, right? That not the bid work itself, but all of the admin costs that we currently pay. So presumably there's enough money in it to do all of these things, the renewals and new bid formations and everything else.
At this time, yes.
Right. But adding more things might put pressure on that, and it might mean we have to go back and add more money to the bid fund to make all this happen. But these are needed activities to support.
Yes.
But it sort of just building on what you're saying, there is a zero-sum game, but that money is used. It's not like there's extra money sitting in this pot. It's money that's used for bid formations, bid renewals, bid admin costs. And what I understand is you're coming and saying, yeah, it's a lot of important admin costs are not included in that. We need to include that, which does mean we have to spread it over a bigger amount, and that does create more pressure on that fund. But so be it. That's what we have to,
that's
just
true.
eyes wide open. That's what we're dealing with, and we might have to put more money into the bid fund in the future to do all the new bids that we want.
Yep, that's correct.
But at this point, that's not a part of what's before us. It's merely changing the purpose of
It's
it.
adding it, which will add more pressure on it. But
Yeah.
The bid fund, are we in any danger at this point of not having enough in there?
No, not today, not this year.
Okay.
Great.
And I'm sorry, for the record, if I could just say Christine Umano here from the City Attorney's Office.
Okay. All right. Is there any other discussion or any objection? Without objection, then it'll be the action of the committee to approve the item, to approve the motion and move it forward. Thank you. All right. So that'll take us into closed session then. So, Mr. Spindler, you can leave now, Mr. Spindler. Mr. Spindler, start heading for the exit. Officer, can you help Mr. Spindler find the door?
Sir.
Thank you very much for your patience. We're back in open session, and item number 11. Do you want to go ahead and read the action that we...
Sure. Richard Williams, Office of the City Clerk. For item number 11, the committee approved the recommendations in the City Attorney Report for the retention of Albright, Yee and Schmidt, LLP, and Tharp and Howell, LLP, as outside counsel.
Well, and to be clear, both of those firms had previously been retained. This is to extend the amount provided under their contract. So, all right. And if there's nothing else, we'll go to item number 14 then.
Item number 14 is a controller report relative to review of idle special purpose funds.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon. Matt Crawford for the Office of the Controller. The report we've put together for you at this point, one of our continuing series of reports on special funds across the city. This particular report covers funds which have not had any spending over at least, at this point, it's almost 4 years. We had to pick a date, so it's about 4 years ago. You can see in the attachment, the list is pretty long. We have 830 special funds total, and 157 of those have no expenditures in that 4-year period of time. A number of these, and a pretty large number of them, have no money in them, but a large number of them have some money, and a few of them have a lot of money in them, as you can see in the list. As we've gone through it, we kind of categorized somewhat what we thought could or should happen with the funds the monies in these funds, and at the same time kind of went through and categorized sort of what kind of funds and tried to put together a story of kind of how we got here. And a large number of these funds were originally grant funds. Some of them somewhat old, some of them really old. We have some 20 and 25-year-old funds here from grants that were received in the 90s, got a few from the 80s. And just the way of the special funds are kind of arranged and managed in the city lends itself to these funds getting set aside and lost, and no one ever sees them again until someone comes back and pulls them all together. So what we've put together is kind of a list for you guys of the funds where we think something can relatively easily be done with the money. And then there are funds which really just the departments in charge of those funds need to get on with it and identify a way to spend the money, but have to stay in those funds. There are a few funds that have outstanding reserve fund loans, and we've recommended that those funds pay those reserve fund loans. And in fact, I would say our kind of follow-up information to this report is subsequent to the release of this report. Recreation Parks actually has paid down one of their reserve fund loans on the Runyon Canyon Trust Fund. So they essentially emptied out that fund to pay more than half of the reserve fund loan on that. So since this report came out, the reserve fund is about $800,000 richer because that loan got repaid. That loan was from 1985. So nice to have that back. Where we, I think, can really look forward and where the work needs to occur on this issue is the areas where we have these old funds and the purpose for which the funds were originally set aside is really no longer meaningful. Whether the grant program is long gone or it was for a specific project and that project has been completed. We identified we have a few bid trust funds where the bid has been inactive for years, but there's still a few $1,000s, 20, 30, I think there's one with 70,000 in it, from a bid that doesn't exist anymore. These are areas where either working with your offices to figure out what can be done in those areas, and or likely working with the city attorney to figure out, like in the specific case of the bids, we kind of need a legal interpretation of what can be done with money that was collected for bid purposes for a bid that doesn't exist anymore. So that I'd open it if you guys have questions. We're certainly, I can talk generally speaking at the table about what we've done and the situation. I would say if you have questions about specific funds, probably easier to handle that offline so that I'm not trying to do stuff off the top of my head.
Great. Well, thank you for the report. This has been a very good collaborative effort that we've engaged in for 4 or 5 years now between this committee and the Controller's Office, and trying to maximize the benefit of these special funds, create a greater organization around them, ensure that administrative costs are recaptured by the general fund, and ultimately, if they're not useful, to figure out an approach for returning the funds to those who paid them, if that's appropriate. So we're making progress. It's methodical process, but your attachment just sort of demonstrates how much nitty-gritty your office has really had to wade into in order to get a handle on this. So I'm going to have some recommendations, members, on the Controller's recommendations, but questions, Mr. Blumenfield?
Well, both a question and sort of a statement, because I always get frustrated when the press misinterprets this kind of thing, and there'll be an article tomorrow saying that we have $28 million of unspent money, and we should spend it on homeless housing or on streets or on this or on that, which would all be great, but as I understand it, and maybe just to clarify for the record, none of these monies can be just spent on unrestricted, or I'll put it in a question, can any of these monies be converted into unrestricted discretionary fund?
With some work, I think we can get to that point. Very little of this money can be just immediately, transferred over for whatever. I think really the reserve fund loans are probably the closest we can get to that in terms of money that is simply and obviously going to be just turned into general fund money. Most of this will require some accounting, probably at this point a fair amount of forensic accounting to figure out if there are old reimbursements to the general fund that are owed and we can get that done. Or in the case of some of these really old grant programs, we may just have to kind of decide through a legislative action or with the help of the city attorney that the time has come to turn that into general fund money. I don't know. That's something we'll have to work with the city attorney on. But certainly to your point, it's not like we could take $28 million and spend it on homeless services. All of these funds all the money here is in specific funds that were created for a specific reason that was legitimate, at least at the time. In many of these cases, it's still very legitimate special purposes. There's a reason these funds exist and the reason the money is there. And it's not to say that we can simply take it all and spend it on whatever we want.
Right. Some of it, if it's grant money, we're probably, and if it's federal or state grant, or we're still bound by the terms of those grants in most cases, I would imagine.
Yes, certainly for a pretty lengthy number of years. It'll depend again on each grant agreement's different, right. And that's where the forensic accounting is going to take.
And the bid formation money, or the bid money, is paid by property owners and is restricted to that area.
Right. So, notwithstanding the legality, the legal questions of a lot of these, I think that's where in our report, our kind of recommendation of how to handle things is for these, if you have an old economic development grant that was supposed to be used, I think we have one for, say, the Crenshaw area. If we can't figure out how to use it pursuant to the original grant agreement, maybe we can find a new economic development purpose in Crenshaw that we can use it on. Everybody will be happy and we can all move on. But again, I just laid out a number of steps which will obviously take some time and effort from a lot of people.
Great, thank you. Mr. Kretz?
So it sounds like without having to go to the point of converting it to general fund money, there are a lot of useful things we can do. Presumably, in the area of old bids, we could spend it on something useful to the community that had the bid been in place, they probably would have spent the money on. Or if you have public safety funds, presumably you could use it to help fund some of the public safety related things we do to deal with the homeless crisis. Or if we couldn't do something that was as on point with our top priority issue, we could do something like pay down some of our overtime bank or something like that. It seems like we wouldn't have to go to the step of making it part of the general fund for it to be useful, particularly in the areas originally intended.
Completely agree. In fact, I think if the view and the angle is really to try and figure out how much of this we can transfer to the general fund, that's going to be a long, hard road. If the view is how can we figure out a good purpose that's as close as we can get to the original intent of these money, I think that's going to be a much easier route to actually utilizing these resources.
And a lot of it will still pay off for the general fund. I mean, if you spent the money on public safety purposes that we typically fund anyway, it takes that much pressure off the general fund. So I would assume some of that at least will be just as useful as if it went to the general fund.
I would expect so.
Although, always keeping in mind that this is the most one-time of all one-time money. And so, to think of, programming this into general fund obligations would be a mistake, I think. It will provide us with supplemental service, really. It'll provide us with more benefits if we can utilize it rather than offsetting existing funded
We certainly would not
amounts.
recommend using any of this to build in, obligations for the city long-term, any sort of continuing funding.
Or
all has to be
reducing the baseline budget for anything in reliance on
No,
this.
this is definitely, as you said, the most one time of one time.
But I think, I think it's important to reiterate Mr. Blumenfield's point about the public's frequent misinterpretation of this. I mean, some of these funds are a few $100, and there is going to be nothing that we're going to be able to find really to be able to do with that. There are other funds that are so strictly constrained that we are legally prohibited from using it on anything because that purpose may no longer exist, and that's the one and only purpose that we can use it for. So it would be a mistake for anyone in the media or anyone out there in the public to think that this report suggests that there's these tens of millions of dollars that are just sitting there waiting to be spent. They're not. They're not at all. Only a tiny fraction of this will probably ever be able to be spent in any meaningful way, and a fair amount of it is ultimately going to probably have to be returned to the provider, or we'll find some other disposition of it, which, as of right now, we don't have before us. We don't have a plan to do that. So it's going to take a lot more legal work before any of this is going to be able to be freed up. So, and which is already anticipated in the report's recommendations, and I appreciate that. So, yeah, go ahead, Mr. Bloomfield.
Some of this, looking at, like I look at the Warner Center's Cultural Affairs Trust Fund, there are reasons why that hasn't, the Arts Trust Fund hasn't been spent, but that's certainly community expectation is that that is going to be spent for that purpose in that area, and there's numerous ways to do that. So,
and that's one of the examples of the funds where we identified where there's been no spending, but there's no opportunity. The purpose is still completely legitimate and live. It's simply an issue of working with the department and the community to figure out a way to use the resources for the purpose intended.
All right. So what I would like to suggest, members, is that we approve recommendations 2, 3, and 4 in the controller's recommendation and report, and that we amend recommendation number 1 to read as follows. That we would instruct the city administrative officer, with the assistance of the city attorney's office, to report on the following. A, provide recommendations to repurpose certain idle funds within each respective funding category, for example, arts, economic development, housing, etc., for the funds recommended in attachment A to the controller's report as funds should be repurposed for other priorities within this category. B, provide recommendations to instruct the related departments to use certain idle funds recommended in attachment A to the controller's report as money should be used to pay reserve fund loan to repay their outstanding reserve fund loans. C, determine the eligible uses for certain idle funds recommended in attachment A to the controller's report as departments should identify eligible uses for these funds to be used within departments' budgets or for other council priorities. And then D, provide recommendations on the process to consolidate certain idle funds into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund for those funds recommended in attachment A to the controller's report as consolidate into Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And with those changes, which if there's no objection, then it will be the action of the committee to act accordingly and to approve the recommendations as amended. Thank you very much. Thanks for your great work on this, Matt, and pass on our best wishes and thanks to the controller as well. All right. The only other item before this committee is general public comment. I see no one here wishing to offer general public comment, so general public comment is closed, and if there's no other business before the committee, we are adjourned.